Hi guys, so today I wanted to cover the material that you want to analyze in the prologue in chapter 1 of the Dressmaker, and we'll be centering our analysis on how it can be compared to Arthur Miller's The Crucible. So one of the first things that you want to kind of look at in the prologue is the fact that Mad Molly's house is quote-unquote leaning provocatively on the grassy curve. So we will get back to this a little bit later, because I want to talk about how women's sexuality is seen as subversive in the Dressmaker and in the Crucible. But the main thing to note about this is that it's very sexualized imagery when referring to a house, and it makes sense because it is Mad Molly's house, and she got pregnant with Tilly out of wedlock, and the people have not really forgotten that about her. They kind of hold it over her head, they hold it over Tilly's head, because it is subversive in their society, and we'll get into it in more depth when we move on to the Crucible, because sexuality is also subversive in the Crucible, but in a very different way. They're approached very differently. Now, the other thing that you probably want to note down at the very start is the word winking in the phrase winking from the home of Mad Molly. So there's a lot of imagery regarding eyes in the Dressmaker, and we'll get into why that is a little bit later in the video when we talk about the oval. So the first thing that is quite substantial and self-contained in the prologue is the hill casting a shadow over the town. So it foreshadows what's going to happen next, because Mad Molly's house is where Tilly resides, and she ends up literally burning the town. So when it casts a shadow over the town, there's a sense of foreboding to it, where it suggests that something about that house, or someone living in that house, is going to lead to the destruction of the town. And note that the hill, the H there is put in a capital letter, it's capitalized. And the reason for that is because it's being treated as a proper noun. The people don't just think of it as a hill, it is to them the hill. They just call it the hill because it's infamous there. So it tells you straight away that this town is kind of rampant with gossip, and people talking about it. So when Tilly calls Dungatar, obviously she has to go through the phone exchange, which you find out a little bit later. But the night shift of the phone exchange is shared by Beulah Harradine and Ruth Dim. Now, yes, the word retort here, in Came the Retort, it suggests something feisty and nasty about the person on the other line, on the other side of the line. But that's not quite what I want to get into. What I want to get into is the fact that it's what Beulah Harradine and Ruth Dim who work the night shift at the phone exchange, and that's because Beulah Harradine and Ruth Dim are the two nosiest women in Dungatar. You have Beulah Harradine, who is the town gossip. She loves to spread malicious lies about people, like she did with the conception of Felicity Joy. And we also see Ruth Dim, who likes to go through people's mail. She likes to steal things in the mail. She treats other people's possessions as if they were her own. She makes decisions about other people's money when they send it through to her at the post office. But the thing to note about these two working the phone exchange is that they, who are the nosiest women in Dungatar, are kind of given these positions in which information is made readily available to them. Especially in the case of Ruth Dim, where everyone's mail has to go through her as well. So it kind of shows that they have a hold on the town. It's almost as if the phone exchange is kind of a network for them to gain more information about other people so that it can be leveraged against them. And that is really a lot of what these two texts are about. They're about how personal indiscretions are exposed in a public place and how that affects the way that we act and the way that we feel. Now, one thing to note about Beulah Harradine's name is that the last name Harradine is a play on the word harridan, which means a vicious, kind of nasty woman. And Dim is also a play on Prudence Dim's bad eyesight, as well as the fact that she's just not the brightest, which is kind of ironic because she's teaching the children of Dungatar. Now, the first part, or the first section of the novel, is called Gingham, and that's because Gingham is durable, much like Tilly, who makes something of herself despite everything that has happened in her past. It's also because there's a sense of uncertainty, because Gingham is so versatile, and the description doesn't quite give us a good idea of what exactly it does and what it can do. And that's how we feel about Tilly and how the story is unfolding. There's a sense of uncertainty because nothing is laid out for us in advance. There's foreshadowing, there's little hints here and there, but nothing quite tells us what direction the story is going to go in. And that's a point that you can kind of compare with the Crucible, because the Crucible lays everything out for us at the very beginning. It tells us all of the context that we need to know, and that's because it uses a storytelling method called Brechtian storytelling, which basically employs a narrator, usually, to give us the context and the information that we need to intellectually engage and break the fourth wall, which does interfere with our emotional engagement in the play, but it kind of sets up all the information that we need to know. And the thing is, as well, is that with the Crucible, readers who know the Salem witch trials will already know how the story is going to go down. We know that people are going to be killed. We know that the girls are going to accuse everyone in the town. But in the case of the Dressmaker, there's no historical context that we need to know, and so the story unravels as we read. Whereas with the Crucible, everything is laid out from the very beginning, and those two differences vastly affect the way they very profoundly impact the way that we read them. In the Crucible, there are a lot of moments that create dramatic irony because we know that people are going to die. We know what the outcome is going to be like for a lot of these trials. Whereas in The Dressmaker, we do get irony, but it's more the irony that we get from the things that people say and the way that they act once we know about their personal indiscretions. Now, moving on to Chapter 1, the very first thing we see is Sergeant Farrat patting his police cap, picking a thread from his lapel, and saluting his neat reflection. Now, we see a preoccupation with his external presentation because he's in what we would consider a masculine job. And this is because he's presenting himself in a way where he is the picture of successful masculinity, and that's to hide how he feels on the inside. We will get into that a little bit later in more detail, especially when we talk about the clothes that he makes and the transformative power of clothing, which we'll get into in a later video. Now, the next thing that we see is how the fog tiptoed around them like gossamer marquees. So the anthropomorphic fog which tiptoed around them suggests something sinister hiding in the town of Dungatar, and that is exactly what the town is like. On the surface, it's quite unassuming. It's just, country folk living in a small town in rural Australia. But we see that there's something sinister to them below the surface a little bit later. There are rapists, there are corrupt people living in that town, and that's because their personal indiscretions are being hidden and they're just beneath the surface. Now, we see that Tilly arrives in a beret and an unusually cut overcoat, and she's wearing fine boots. There's something distinctly foreign and something that doesn't quite fit in with the scenery there, because we see that Dungatar is described as a place that's quite dilapidated, and it's even in the name Dungatar. But what I wanted to get at here is that the clothing that people wear in this novel reveals something about their character, especially the material of the clothing and the accessories. And we see that with, say, Elsbeth's marcasite brooches. We see that with the women wearing silk and felt. We see that with the gingham skirt. But we'll get into the individual symbolism of each material when we get to them and when they appear in the text. But for now, just note down that clothing reveals something about their character so that you can look out for it as you're reading. The next thing that we see is that the narrator says Tilly had grown into a woman. Now, the narrator refers to Myrtle as Tilly here for the first time in the chapter. It happened once in the prologue when he or she said Tilly decided she would go back to Dungatar, because returning is representative of a regression in her psyche, because she's returning to the place of her trauma so that she can heal. Now, if you look at the name Tilly versus Myrtle, Tilly is more childish in the way that it sounds, and that's how we can see that it's representative of a regression. Now in chapter 1, we also see that Tilly has memories of being driven to the bus stop all those years ago by the same man, and how those memories rose up and turned to the knot in her stomach. So once again, it's foreshadowed but not explicitly stated what happened there. We know that she's probably had a run-in with the law at some point because it says that she was driven by Sergeant Farrat, but we're not quite sure what happened. And once again, it's because the story unravels as we read, as opposed to it all being presented to us from the very start. When Tilly goes back to Mad Molly's home, we see that Mad Molly has a kapok pillow in her wheelchair. And kapok is a rough material, and you can compare it to the cashmere that Tilly drapes over her, and you can see that Tilly is filial despite their emotional distance, because Molly has gone insane. Tilly hasn't spoken to her or seen her in many years, and when she calls or writes, there's no response. Now, you could probably talk about this in the context of love, in the two texts, and how the texts differ in their representations of love. Now, another thing that you'd probably want to note down is that Molly is referred to as a quote-unquote mad woman and crone. So she's part of what we would call the tripartite goddess. So the tripartite goddess is made up of a crone, a mother, and a maiden. And it makes sense that Tilly and Molly are kind of making up those three parts, because they're the main forces that subvert the patriarchy, that kind of patriarchal societal structure in Dungatar. So Molly is the crone, she's literally described as the crone. Tilly starts off as the maiden. We don't know that she's had a child, we don't know that that child died, but at first she's the romantic interest of William and Teddy. And then when we find out about Pablo, we think of her as the mother. And at that stage, when we find out about Pablo, her relationship with Teddy had already terminated because he was dead, and William was already married to Gertrude. We will get into Gertrude changing her name to Trudy at a later point. But at that point, her relationship with the men had already kind of terminated. So that way we see her solely as the mother. And it makes sense because at that point, we grow afraid of what she can do and what she's going to do. There's something more intimidating about her. Now, in the first chapter, when she reaches Mad Molly's home, she cleans it. It says that she evicted snug families of mice. Now, the cleaning is a metaphor for purging of old norms and the conservative ideas of Dungatar. And it's a great comparison for the Crucible, because the Crucible is literally named after a crucible, and that's a receptacle in which people put chemical compounds and metals and the like, so that it burns away or applies high enough temperature to separate the impurities, or separate the different components. Now, it's a great comparison because it's talking about the purging of old things. In this case here, in the Dressmaker, it's about old ideas, whereas in the Crucible, it's purging of a so-called evil that they believe in. Now, another thing that you want to get down is the lavender flowers from the garden. So, the herb garden represents feminine power, witchcraft, goodness, because herb lore has long been associated with witches and wise women. And why it's about goodness is because Tilly uses herbs to heal or to do good things for the people of Dungatar. For example, she helps Mrs. Almanac, and she indirectly helps Marigold because she makes Evan Pettyman impotent using the power of marigolds from her garden. We will get into why each of the herbs is used in a specific way, but for now, note down that she did use marigold to help Marigold. We will get into that name when it comes up in the text. The other thing with the herbs to note is that the men used traditional medicine to kind of get a chokehold on the town of Dungatar and to get away with the things that they do. And they use it for their own personal vendettas and for their own personal reasons. And oftentimes it's to the detriment of others. So Evan Pettyman uses pills and sleep serums and the like, sleep tonics, in order to put his wife Marigold Pettyman to bed. That way he rapes her while she's unconscious. It's a strong word, but that's why I use it, because he does rape her. And in the case of Mr. Almanac, he refuses to prescribe medicine to his ill, suffering wife, and he also abuses his power in that he adds a lily abrasive, I believe it was, to Faith O'Brien's kind of cream that she wants to use for her STD. Because he's judging her, he's saying she's been unfaithful, so I'm going to punish her, when really it wasn't his place to do so. Now, there is something ironic about the name Faith, and speaking of another name that is ironic, myrtle, ironically enough, is a flower that symbolizes love. So, some people try to avoid analyzing names in the Crucible because Arthur Miller chose names of real people, historically people who were actually in the town of Salem. But I would say that names are okay for analysis in the Crucible, and the reason is because Arthur Miller actually chose specific names from a larger group of people who actually existed in Salem at the time, because that way he has less characters and it's easier to keep track of. So yes, they are real names, but he had to select them individually. Now this is where we get into the imagery of the eyes in the Dressmaker. So there's the quote, "The green eye of the oval looked back at Tilly." So Mad Molly's house overlooks the entire town because it's a quote-unquote blot shimmering at the edge of the flatness. So it's the only house that's elevated in a town where everything is flat. So it acts as a literal moral high ground because Molly and Tilly are, for the most part of the text, at least for the first, say, half, they're victims, really. But at the same time, their house is also subject to the most scrutiny because it's visible from all angles. And that's something that you can discuss in relation to the Crucible as well, because the people who cling to their moral high ground are subject to the greatest persecution. So if you look at people like John Proctor and Rebecca Nurse, they're the people who suffer the most because they refuse to lie and they refuse to falsely accuse others of witchcraft, and as a result, they're tortured and they're killed. We will get into the kind of moral implications of John Proctor's choice to essentially condemn himself by ripping up his confession, and we will talk about that in relation to the difference between a moral choice and an ethical choice, as well as deontological morality and utilitarian morality, but we'll get to that when it comes up. So the way that I want to structure this is to cover the individual chapters of the Dressmaker, and after I've done that, I want to cover the individual chapters of the Crucible like I've done here, where I note all the points that you'll need for your comparison. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. It's a kind of beginning point, but I want you to get an idea for how you should go about analysing these texts and what you can and can't compare. So that is all for this video. Hopefully you guys learned something, and thanks for watching.